They thought $5 could buy 15 minutes of happiness. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the drug that didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed entire zip codes. Crack cocaine. A substance so cheap, so brutal, and so perfectly engineered for addiction that it turned American cities into something that looked like the aftermath of a war nobody officially declared. And here's the part that should make you put down whatever you're drinking. The whole thing started not in some shadowy laboratory or cartel compound, but in a kitchen, with baking soda, the kind sitting in your refrigerator right now next to the leftovers. In the early 1980s, powder cocaine was the glamour drug. Wall Street traders snorted it off glass desks. Rock stars packed it into silver cases. It was expensive, exclusive, and somehow, and this is the part that requires a very particular kind of American insanity, considered sophisticated, a rich man's vice, a lifestyle accessory. Then somebody figured out that if you took that same cocaine, dissolved it in water, cooked it with baking soda, and let it harden into a small rock, you got something that hit the brain not through the nose and into the bloodstream over several minutes, but directly through the lungs and into the brain in 8 seconds flat. 8 seconds. The high was 10 times more intense than powder cocaine and lasted on average 15 minutes. 15 minutes of the most euphoric sensation the human nervous system is chemically capable of producing. And then it was gone. And the only thing a person wanted in the world was to feel it again. The price? $2 to $5 a rock. Less than a pack of cigarettes. Less than a Happy Meal. The drug that would hollow out Black America and send over 1 million people to prison cost less than a fast food lunch. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what America looked like in 1984. Ronald Reagan was on television telling everyone that it was morning in America. The economy was recovering. Suburbs were gleaming. The Cold War was the big threat, the big story, the thing everyone was afraid of. Nuclear missiles pointed at Moscow, Moscow pointing back. In that context, nobody was looking at a small apartment in Overtown, Miami, where a man named Ricky Ross, no relation to the rapper, though the rapper borrowed his name deliberately, was about to change the economics of American drug dealing forever. Ross wasn't a chemist. He wasn't a criminal mastermind in the movie sense. He was a former tennis player from Los Angeles who couldn't afford college tuition and found himself connected to a Nicaraguan supplier named Danilo Blandon, who had access to enormous quantities of cheap Colombian cocaine. What Ross figured out, almost accidentally, was that converting powder cocaine into crack and selling it in small, affordable rocks didn't just expand the market, it created an entirely new one. Poor neighborhoods, working-class neighborhoods, places where nobody had $200 for a gram of powder, but almost everyone could scrape together $5 on a Tuesday afternoon. The business model was catastrophic in its simplicity, low price point, extremely high addiction rate, repeat customers guaranteed, not by loyalty, but by neuroscience. Crack spread from Los Angeles to Miami to New York in roughly 18 months. By 1985, it was moving up the highway corridors like a virus that had found the perfect host. Chicago received it the way a dry forest receives a spark. Marcus Webb was 24 years old in the summer of 1984, and he had never heard the word crack. He knew about cocaine. Everyone in his neighborhood on Chicago's South Side knew about cocaine the way they knew about Ferraris, something that existed in a world adjacent to theirs, occasionally visible, never quite touchable. Marcus wasn't interested in it. He had 2 jobs and a plan, which put him ahead of a significant percentage of young men in his situation, a fact he was quietly, privately proud of. Days, He worked the loading dock at a warehouse on the Calumet River. Evenings, 3 nights a week, he stocked shelves at a grocery store on 79th Street. The money wasn't good, but it accumulated. He was saving for a car. After the car, an apartment that wasn't on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator hadn't worked since 1979. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man headed for catastrophe. That fact is worth sitting with for a moment, because the story America told itself about crack addicts required them to already be broken before the drug arrived. It needed them to be weak, or poor in some moral sense, or predisposed towards self-destruction. That story was useful because it meant the drug was a symptom of a pre-existing condition rather than the cause of a new one. It meant the system didn't have to look at itself. Marcus Webb was the inconvenient contradiction to that story. A young man with ambition, humour, a mother who made Sunday dinner every week without exception, and a girlfriend named Denise who was 8 months pregnant with their first child. He was also black, poor, and living in a neighbourhood that was about to be flooded with the cheapest, most addictive substance ever synthesized, with essentially no institutional support to slow its arrival. The combination of those two facts, his fundamental decency and his structural vulnerability, is what made what happened to him not a personal failing but a collision. A man standing on a train track, not because he wanted to be there, but because the track had been quietly built around him while he was busy working 2 jobs. Chicago in 1984 had a specific texture that's hard to describe without living it. The steel mills that had employed a generation of Southside men were closing or already closed. The jobs that replaced them paid less, offered less security, and required more education than the generation before had been given access to. The neighbourhood Marcus grew up in, Englewood, had been losing population since the 1970s, as anyone who could afford to leave did exactly that. What remained was a community under pressure, tight-knit in the way that communities become tight-knit when they have no other choice. Block parties, church socials, grandmothers who knew every child on the street by name. This social fabric was real, but it was stretched. Marcus's mother, Gloria, had raised him and his younger sister Tanya in a 3-bedroom apartment on South Racine Avenue since Marcus's father left in 1968 when Marcus was 8 years old. Gloria worked as a home health aide, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. She was not a woman who complained. She was a woman who cooked and cleaned and prayed and attended every school play, and somehow, through a combination of stubbornness and grace that Marcus would spend the rest of his life trying to fully understand, kept the apartment warm and the refrigerator stocked and the front door open. He brought Denise to meet her in 1982. Gloria made her feel welcome with the kind of immediate, uncalculating warmth that some people are simply born with. By 1984, Denise was pregnant, and Marcus was working 2 jobs, and Gloria was quietly, happily redesigning the small back bedroom as a nursery. The future, in other words, was not abstract. It was 9 months away and already had a name. They were going to call her Keisha. The first time Marcus encountered crack was at a neighbourhood gathering in September 1984, 3 weeks after Keisha was born. It wasn't a party in any dramatic sense. A friend of a friend's apartment, 15, maybe 20 people, music. Someone had brought a bottle of something, the kind of gathering that happened every other weekend in every neighbourhood in every city in America, unremarkable except for one thing. Someone in the kitchen had a pipe. Marcus didn't know what it was at first. He'd never seen a crack pipe. Nobody in his immediate circle had. The man holding it, an older guy, maybe 35, who Marcus vaguely knew from the neighbourhood, didn't look like someone in the grip of a dangerous substance. He looked relaxed, comfortable. He looked the way people sometimes look after a second drink, that pleasant, easy loosening of the muscles. He offered it to Marcus the way you offer someone a beer. casual, social, without weight. Marcus had smoked marijuana maybe a dozen times in his life and felt mostly sleepy afterward. He wasn't a drug person. He said no. Then someone turned up the music and he had a drink, and 20 minutes later the man offered again, and Marcus thought, and this is the thought that 1,000 addiction researchers have tried to reduce to a formula and never quite managed. He thought, why not? The pipe went to his lips, the smoke went to his lungs, and 8 seconds later Marcus Webb felt something he had no framework for. It wasn't like being drunk. It wasn't like being high on marijuana. It was more fundamental than either. It was as though every circuit in his brain that had been running at normal power had suddenly been connected to a different source. Everything, his own heartbeat, the music coming from the other room, the sensation of the air against his skin, became simultaneously sharper and warmer and more correct than anything had ever felt before. He felt capable. He felt fearless. He felt in some way that bypassed language entirely, like himself, but perfected. 15 minutes later, it was gone. The absence it left was not neutral. The absence was its own thing, a specific physical hollowness that sat behind his sternum and pulled. His hands felt wrong. The music sounded flat. The room, which had seemed fine before, now seemed insufficient in some way he couldn't name. He wanted to feel that thing again. He wanted it with a clarity and urgency that was completely unlike wanting another beer or another slice of pizza. This was not appetite. This was something older and more serious, something that lived below thought. He didn't take a second hit that night. He went home. He looked at Denise sleeping with Keisha on her chest and felt a complicated wave of something. Love, relief, a faint unease he didn't examine closely enough. He didn't know yet that the unease was the correct response. He didn't know yet that crack cocaine triggers the release of dopamine at roughly 10 times the level of any natural reward the human brain encounters. He didn't know that the brain, confronted with that level of artificial stimulation, begins almost immediately to reduce its own natural dopamine production in an attempt to compensate. He didn't know that this process, this neurochemical recalibration, can begin within the first few uses, meaning the brain starts rewiring itself around the drug before the person has consciously decided they have a problem. He didn't know any of this, because nobody had told him. There was no public health campaign aimed at Southside Chicago in 1984. There was no school program. There was no warning on the pipe the way there was a warning on a cigarette pack. There was just the pipe, and the smoke, and the 8 seconds, and then the 15 minutes of feeling like a better version of everything you were. Marcus went to work the next morning. He loaded boxes at the warehouse, ate lunch from a vending machine, took the bus home, held his daughter. He didn't think about the pipe all morning. By the afternoon, he thought about it once, briefly, the way you think about a song you heard and can't quite place. By the evening, he thought about it with a specificity that surprised him. Not the general idea of it, but the exact sensation, the warmth spreading from his chest outward, the way the room had briefly become the best version of itself. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself one more time wouldn't mean anything. He found the man with the pipe 3 days later. What happened in the 6 weeks after that first hit follows a pattern so consistent across thousands of documented cases that researchers eventually gave it a name, the honeymoon phase. The addict uses regularly but hasn't yet lost anything visibly important. They're functioning. They believe they're managing. The drug is still delivering something close to the original high, which means the brain hasn't yet fully recalibrated, which means withdrawal isn't yet producing the kind of physical agony that would make the cost undeniable. The trap is built during the honeymoon. The door is swung shut quietly without drama, while the person inside is still smiling. Marcus used 4 more times in those 6 weeks. He told himself 4 times was nothing. told himself he could stop whenever he wanted, told himself the guys at the warehouse who drank every single night were worse off than he was. On the 7th use, something shifted. He couldn't have named it in the moment, wouldn't have, even if he could. But the high was slightly shorter, slightly less complete. The hollowness afterward was slightly deeper, and the speed with which he wanted to use again, minutes after finishing, not hours, was something new and different from anything that had come before. The trap had finished closing. Marcus just didn't know he was inside it yet. The human brain is, among other things, a prediction machine. Every experience a person has gets filed, catalogued and weighted by a small structure deep in the brain called the nucleus accumbens, sometimes called the brain's reward center, though that name makes it sound friendlier than it is. What this structure actually does is measure pleasure and then tell the rest of the brain how much effort is worth expending to get it again. A good meal registers, sex registers, a promotion registers. The brain notes these things, assigns them value, and adjusts behavior accordingly. This is normal. This is survival. This is the mechanism that made human beings want to eat and reproduce and build things. Crack cocaine does not work within this system. It hijacks it. A single hit of crack floods the nucleus accumbens with dopamine at a level no natural experience can match. Not food, not sex, not the birth of a child, not the best day of a person's life. The brain, encountering this artificial flood, does the only thing it knows how to do. It recalibrates. It reduces the number of dopamine receptors available, trying to restore balance. The result is that everything else in a person's life, every natural source of pleasure, every reason to get out of bed, every relationship and goal and quiet joy, becomes chemically dimmer, not metaphorically dimmer, measurably, neurologically, literally less rewarding than it was before. The drug becomes, by neurochemical default, the most important thing in the world. Not because the person decided that, because their brain was restructured to make it true. Marcus Webb had no idea any of this was happening inside his skull. Neither did most of the doctors treating addicts in 1984. By November of that year, Marcus was using crack twice a week. He was still showing up to both jobs, still coming home at reasonable hours, still holding Keisha on Sunday mornings while Denise slept in, something that had become their quiet routine, the baby on his chest, cartoons on the television with the volume low. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. The warehouse job had become intolerable in a new way. It had always been physically demanding and poorly paid, but Marcus had managed that by keeping his focus on what the money was building toward. The car, the better apartment, the future that existed somewhere past the current difficulty. Now the future felt abstract and the difficulty felt enormous, and the only thing that cut through the grey weight of an 8-hour shift was knowing that after the shift there was the pipe. He hadn't framed it that way to himself, not yet. He thought of it the way some people think of a drink after work, a reward, a release valve, something earned rather than needed. The distinction between earned and needed was dissolving faster than he understood. His spending started shifting in ways too subtle to notice individually, but devastating in aggregate. A pack of cigarettes skipped here. A phone bill paid late there. Small recalibrations of the household budget that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Denise noticed the phone bill. Marcus explained it away with a story about a dispute with the company, a story he invented in the moment with an ease that surprised even him. The lying had arrived so quietly he barely recognized it as lying. It felt more like management, managing the gap between what was happening and what he needed people to believe was happening. The gap was widening every week. Crack cocaine in late 1984. Chicago was not yet the full-scale epidemic it would become within 18 months. but it was spreading through certain neighborhoods with the quiet efficiency of something that has found ideal conditions. The South Side was ideal conditions. Unemployment among young black men in Englewood and neighbouring Grand Crossing was above 40%. The social structures that might have provided alternatives, stable employment, functioning schools, community centres, had been systematically defunded through the 1970s and early 1980s. The physical infrastructure of the neighbourhood reflected this. Vacant lots where buildings had been demolished and never replaced, storefronts shuttered behind metal grates, parks that parents no longer felt comfortable sending children to after dark. Into this landscape, crack arrived not as an invasion, but as an answer. A wrong answer, a catastrophic answer, but an answer nonetheless. To boredom, to hopelessness, to the specific psychic weight of living in a place that the rest of the country had decided didn't matter. It was cheap enough to be accessible and powerful enough to make the world temporarily tolerable. The people selling it understood this intuitively even if they couldn't articulate it. They positioned themselves not as predators, but as providers, and in the short-term pharmacological sense, they weren't entirely wrong. Marcus knew 2 other people in his immediate circle who were using by December. He didn't know he knew them. They didn't know about him. This was how crack moved through communities in its early stages. Not openly, not in groups, but person by person, each user believing they were somehow peripheral to the thing that was consuming them. January 1985. Keisha was 4 months old, round-faced and watchful, with her grandmother Gloria's eyes. Denise had gone back to work at the laundry 2 weeks earlier, leaving Keisha with Gloria 3 days a week. The apartment on South Racine was cramped and cold. The radiator in the back bedroom had been unreliable since October, but it was functional. It was a life, modest, pressured, but real. Marcus had his first experience of what street users called the devils in the 3rd week of January. The devils was the term for the paranoid hallucinations that crack cocaine induces in regular users, typically appearing after extended use sessions or during the crash that follows a binge. Neurologically, what's happening is a combination of dopamine depletion and the hyperactivation of the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, which, stripped of its normal chemical balance, begins generating threat signals without external input. In practical terms, it means a person sitting in a room begins to believe someone is outside the door, or that the people around them are talking about them, or that there are figures in the peripheral vision that disappear when looked at directly, or that sounds, a car backfiring, a neighbour's television, footsteps in the hallway, carry specific malevolent meaning. Marcus experienced his first episode alone in the apartment on a Thursday evening when Denise was at her sister's house. He had used twice that day, more than usual, and the crash had been harder and deeper than anything before it. He sat on the kitchen floor for 2 hours, convinced that someone was moving around in the space between the walls. He couldn't explain it later. By the time Denise came home, he had talked himself out of it, reclassified it as tiredness, stress, the accumulated pressure of new fatherhood and 2 jobs. He believed this explanation. He needed to. What he should have recognized was that the devils don't arrive early. They arrive after the brain has already been significantly restructured. Their appearance in a user's experience is less a warning sign than a milestone marker. Proof that the addiction has moved past the initial phase and into something more systemic, more serious, and exponentially harder to reverse. February brought a specific crisis that Marcus navigated with a resourcefulness that would have impressed him under different circumstances. His hours at the warehouse were cut. A slow period, the supervisor said. Nothing personal. His income dropped by roughly 1/3. A reasonable response would have been to cut discretionary spending. Marcus cut everything except crack, not consciously, not in a single decision. It happened through a series of smaller choices, each of which felt in the moment like the only available option. The grocery bill shrank. The phone bill went unpaid again. A small amount of money Denise kept in an envelope in the bedroom drawer, emergency cash, $40, disappeared and was replaced 3 days later with 38, then 30, then not replaced at all. Denise found the empty envelope in the second week of February. She didn't immediately connect it to drugs. The thought crossed her mind, but she dismissed it, because Marcus wasn't the kind of person who did drugs, and because the alternative explanation, that he was in financial trouble and too ashamed to tell her, was both plausible and easier to absorb. She raised it with him. He apologized. He made up the money within a week, working an extra shift at the grocery store. The crisis passed. The surface smoothed over, and both of them chose, for different reasons with different levels of awareness, not to press further. This is one of addiction's most reliable mechanisms. It doesn't destroy everything at once. It destroys things in amounts small enough to be explainable, forgivable, and attributable to ordinary life stress. It lets relationships absorb the first blow, and the second, and the third, before the cumulative damage becomes undeniable. By the time the people around an addict understand what they're actually dealing with, the addiction has already been operating unimpeded for months. March. Marcus was using 4 times a week, sometimes 5. The grocery store job was gone. He'd shown up late 3 times in 2 weeks, and the manager, a precise Polish man who ran his store the way some people run military operations, had let him go with the flat efficiency of someone who had made this decision many times before. Marcus told Denise the store was cutting hours. He told himself he'd find something else within 2 weeks. He found something else within 4, a part-time position at a car wash on Halstead, paying less and offering fewer hours, but enough to maintain the fiction of employment. The warehouse job miraculously was still intact. He protected it with the specific, almost tactical focus that addicts reserve for the things that fund their addiction. He never missed a shift at the warehouse. He was never late. He was, by all observable measures at that job, a reliable and capable worker. His supervisor had no complaints. His co-workers noticed nothing wrong. The crack had, in this phase, organized his entire existence around itself without his participation in the decision. Everything was now sorted into 2 categories: things that served the addiction and things that didn't. The warehouse job served it. Denise's trust served it, as long as it was maintained at the minimum viable level. His mother served it, though he hadn't yet stolen from Gloria, a line he told himself firmly and repeatedly he would never cross. He believed that. He believed it completely. There is a specific kind of self-knowledge that crack cocaine destroys first, before it destroys anything else, not intelligence. Addicts in the grip of crack can be shockingly rational about everything except the addiction itself. Not memory, not even, in the early stages, personality. What it destroys first is the ability to accurately assess one's own situation. The neurological term is impaired metacognition. The brain loses access to the part of itself that can step back and evaluate its own processes honestly. The addict doesn't just lie to others. They lose the capacity, at least regarding the addiction, to avoid lying to themselves. Marcus, by March 1985, had constructed an internal architecture of self-deception, so elaborate and load-bearing that dismantling any part of it felt like structural risk. He was not an addict. Addicts were the men he'd started to see on certain corners, hollow-eyed and grey-skinned, who moved with the particular boneless shuffle of people who had stopped caring about being watched. He was someone who used occasionally, recreationally, who had been under financial stress and was managing it, who would cut back soon when things stabilized, Things were not stabilizing. Things had not stabilized in 6 months and showed no signs of beginning. Keisha was pulling herself to standing now, holding onto the edge of the coffee table, falling and trying again with the single-minded, cheerful determination of someone who hasn't yet learned that falling is supposed to discourage you. Marcus watched her do this one evening in April and felt something move through him. Not the chemical warmth of crack, nothing like that, but the real thing, the older thing, the one crack had been slowly dimming. He felt it clearly for about 30 seconds. Then it faded back under the surface noise of his brain's constant low-level demand. He left the apartment 40 minutes later. In his jacket pocket he found the small glass pipe he'd transferred there 2 days ago and told himself he'd throw away. He turned it over in his fingers in the stairwell, feeling the smooth curve of it. He didn't throw it away. He never threw it away. And somewhere in the part of his mind that could still assess things honestly, the part that was shrinking every week, he knew exactly what that meant. While Marcus was standing in that stairwell turning a pipe over in his fingers, the city around him was being dismantled from the inside out. Chicago in 1985 was not one city. It was several cities stacked on top of each other, separated not by walls but by something more durable. Zip codes, skin colour, the invisible lines that determined which streets got ploughed first after a snowstorm, and which schools got new textbooks, and which neighbourhoods got bank loans. In the gleaming towers of the Loop, traders were moving money in quantities that would have been incomprehensible to anyone on South Racine Avenue. In Lincoln Park and Wicker Park, young professionals were buying cheap housing in neighbourhoods nobody from their background had lived in before, calling it pioneering. 14 miles south, in Inglewood and Roseland and Woodlawn, something else entirely was underway. Something that would not make the front page of the Tribune for another 18 months, by which point it would already be too late to contain. Crack had arrived in Chicago's South Side neighbourhoods with a speed and completeness that, in retrospect, looks less like a market finding its consumers and more like a detonation. The conditions for ignition had been building for years. The drug was the spark. To understand the speed of what happened, you have to understand the economics of crack dealing, because the economics were unlike anything that had existed before in the American drug trade. Powder cocaine had always been a relatively capital-intensive business. You needed money to buy weight, connections to access the supply chain, and a customer base with disposable income. The margins were good, but the barriers to entry were real, which meant the trade remained concentrated among a relatively small number of organised operations. Crack changed every variable simultaneously. The production cost was minimal. Cocaine, baking soda, water, a stove. The rocks could be sold in units so small that almost anyone could afford to buy them. The addiction rate was so high that once a customer used 2 or 3 times, they were functionally guaranteed to return. And the profit margins, calculated per dollar of raw material, were extraordinary. A kilogram of cocaine that wholesaled for $15,000 could be converted into crack and retailed for $50,000 or more. The markup was not a business advantage. It was a transformation of the entire industry. Chicago's street gangs had been operating sophisticated drug distribution networks since the 1970s, primarily in heroin. They had the infrastructure, the territories, the corner networks, the capacity for violence that enforced market control. What they lacked was a product with crack's economic profile. When crack arrived, the gangs didn't adopt it cautiously. They restructured around it with a speed that reflected genuine, if catastrophically misapplied, entrepreneurial instinct. The gangster disciples, already one of the most organisationally sophisticated street gangs in the country, moved into crack distribution with the methodical efficiency of a franchise operation. Territories were subdivided. Corner assignments were systematized. Pricing was standardized. and the ranks were expanded dramatically downward in age, because crack dealing, unlike heroin dealing, required less experience and generated enough revenue to pay large numbers of people, even at the lowest levels of the hierarchy. By 1986, there were 12-year-old boys serving as lookouts on corners throughout Englewood, making more money in a week than their fathers had made in a month at the steel mills before the mills closed. The vice lords were expanding their crack operation northward from their traditional base at the same time. The result was not a negotiated division of territory. It was a war fought block by block, with casualties measured in teenagers. Drive-by shootings, which had been relatively rare on Chicago's South Side before 1984, became weekly events by 1986, then daily. The Chicago Police Department's Homicide Division, already understaffed and underfunded, began tracking a murder rate that climbed each year with the mechanical consistency of something being inflated by an external pump. In 1984, Chicago recorded 559 homicides. By 1992, at the epidemic's height, that number would reach 943. The vast majority were concentrated in the same South Side and West Side neighborhoods where crack had taken root. The math was not complicated. The connection was not subtle. And yet the public policy response, when it finally materialized, would be aimed not at the conditions that had made those neighborhoods vulnerable, but at the people living in them. What was happening on those streets had a texture that statistics don't capture. A nurse named Patricia Cole, who worked at Stroger Hospital's emergency department starting in 1985, would later describe the change as arriving between one year and the next like a weather shift. One spring, the gunshot wounds were the usual Saturday night volume. The next spring, the volume had tripled and the patients were younger, and the wounds were different, higher caliber, more deliberate. She began keeping her own informal record because the hospital's official numbers felt inadequate to describe what she was seeing. A high school basketball player named Darnell Simmons, 17 years old and being scouted by 2 Division I programs, stopped showing up to practice in October 1985. His coach drove to his house 3 times. Nobody answered the door. Darnell resurfaced 6 months later, 40 pounds lighter, working as a runner for a dealer on the corner of 71st and Halstead. He was not an anomaly. He was a pattern. The supply chain that fed all of this ran through a geography most Chicago residents would never see. Colombian cocaine moved north from Medellin and Cali through Panama and Mexico, entering the United States through South Florida and the Texas border in quantities that the DEA, despite genuine effort, could not meaningfully intercept. Miami was the primary distribution hub, a city whose banking sector quietly absorbed billions in drug money through the early 1980s, while its waterfront neighborhoods became the most violent in the country. From Miami, the supply moved inland through distribution networks that connected major cities with a logistical sophistication that rivaled legitimate wholesale operations. Chicago received its supply primarily through 2 channels. The first was direct connection to Miami distributors, maintained by a small number of Chicago-based operators who had the capital and connections to buy at wholesale weight. The second, more diffuse channel was the 65 corridor, the highway running north from Indianapolis through which smaller quantities moved in cars, trucks, and buses, concealed in ways that range from professional to absurd. The DE had field offices in Chicago. The FBI was watching certain gang operations. The Chicago Police Department had a narcotics division. None of these institutional presences stopped the supply. Some of them, through incompetence or corruption, or simple institutional inadequacy, made it easier. Individual officers on the South Side's most drug-saturated beats were, in certain cases, extracting payment from dealers in exchange for advance warning of the raids. This was not universal, but it was not rare enough. The supply, in other words, was not a natural disaster. It was a system, and systems have architects. Marcus was watching all of this from a particular vantage point, inside it, close enough to see the details, far enough from the centre that he could still tell himself he wasn't really part of it. He knew the corners had changed. He knew boys from his block who had been talking about jobs at McDonald 6 months ago were now making real money doing things that could put them in prison or the ground, and that some of them seemed genuinely unbothered by either possibility. He knew the trap house 2 buildings down from the car wash where he worked, a building everyone on the block knew the function of, including the beat cop who drove past it at the same times every day. He knew these things the way people know things they've decided not to act on. Ambient knowledge, background noise. What he was less able to see clearly was how much of himself he recognized in the people he was still telling himself he was nothing like. The guy on the corner who spent his whole shift scanning the street for threats. Marcus knew that hypervigilance. He'd been doing it himself for months, watching for any sign that Denise or his mother had noticed the money disappearing, the lies accumulating, the version of himself that was becoming less and less consistent with the version he'd been before September 1984. The guy shuffling past the car wash at 10 in the morning with no apparent destination, Marcus knew that too, not yet, but he recognized the direction. By mid-1985, crack had done something to Englewood's social ecosystem that was harder to measure than the homicide rate, but possibly more destructive in the long term. It had corroded trust. Neighbours who had watched out for each other's children for 30 years started keeping their own counsel. Block associations that had been meeting monthly stopped meeting. The informal networks of mutual aid, the borrowing of a cup of sugar that was actually a system of community surveillance and support, frayed and then snapped under the weight of not knowing who was using, who was selling, and who could no longer be relied upon. A woman named Carla Hutchins had lived on the same block of South Paulina Street for 22 years. In 1985, she installed bars on her ground floor windows for the first time, not because crime had reached her door, because she could feel it approaching, and trust, the thing that had once made the bars unnecessary, was no longer something she could afford. A mother of 3 named Beverly Sims began selling her children's food stamps for crack in the spring of 1985. She was 31 years old, had never used drugs before in her life, and had been introduced to crack by a man she was dating who framed it as something they could share, something intimate and exciting. Within 3 months, the food in the apartment was whatever the children's school provided for free during the week. On weekends, it was whatever Beverly's mother could bring when she came to check on the grandchildren, with a particular dread of someone who already knew the answer to the question they were about to ask. Beverly was not a bad mother who became an addict. She was a mother who became an addict, and the distinction, though it sounds semantic, is the difference between understanding what happened and simply judging it. Marcus passed Beverly's building on his way to and from the car wash, though he didn't know her and couldn't have identified which window was hers. He passed it in the mornings looking forward to the shift being over, and in the evenings calculating how much he'd earned and how much he needed, and how long it would take to get from the car wash to his source. His source was a young man named Dre, 20 years old, who operated out of a spot on 69th Street, and kept his inventory in a deodorant stick he'd hollowed out with remarkable precision. The transaction between them took 45 seconds and cost Marcus $12. $12 for 2 rocks, 2 hits, maybe 3 if he was careful, enough to produce a high that would last 30 minutes total before the crash arrived. 30 minutes of relief from the grey weight of his own brain, followed by 2 hours of hollowness that no non-chemical experience could touch. He did this math every day. He did it while holding his daughter. He did it while eating Sunday dinner at his mother's table. He did it sitting in the dark of the car wash break room, smelling of soap and exhaust, watching the minute hand move. The city was burning around him, block by block, deal by deal, and Marcus Webb was both witness and fuel. He just hadn't admitted either part yet. Denise found out on a Thursday in August 1985, not through a confession, not through a dramatic confrontation. She found out the way most people find out about things that have been true for a long time, by accident, in a moment so ordinary it felt almost insulting. She was doing laundry. She checked the pockets of Marcus's jeans before putting them in the machine, the way she always did, because Marcus had ruined 2 good shirts by leaving pens in his pocket, and the washing machine had no sympathy for carelessness. In the left front pocket she found $3 and a receipt from the car wash. In the right front pocket she found a crack pipe and 2 small Ziploc bags with white residue. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't even, in those first minutes, particularly angry. What she felt was the specific cold sensation of retroactive understanding. Every late night, every missing $20, every explanation that had seemed slightly too smooth, suddenly reorganizing themselves into a pattern that had been there all along. She'd been reading a book in which every page made slightly more sense if you knew the ending. And now she knew the ending, and she was going back through the pages in her mind and finding that she had understood nothing. When Marcus came home that evening, the pipe and the bags were on the kitchen table between them. He didn't deny it. That surprised her, and perhaps surprised him. He had been lying with such fluency for so long that the truth arrived in the room like a third person. Awkward, unwelcome, taking up more space than either of them had anticipated. He admitted he'd been using. He said it wasn't as bad as it looked. He said he could stop. He said all the things that addiction researchers have catalogued so thoroughly, they've given them a collective name: minimization, bargaining, and the promise of future control that the speaker genuinely believes in the moment and has no neurological capacity to keep. Denise gave him 2 weeks. He lasted 11 days before she found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m, pipe in hand, a stillness on his face that she would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. It wasn't peace. It wasn't euphoria. It was something more like absence, the expression of a person who has, for the duration of a chemical reaction, ceased to want anything they don't already have. She took Keisha to her mother's house the next morning. She told Marcus she would be back when he got help. She meant it. She came back twice in the following month, each time hoping, each time leaving again with the particular exhaustion of someone who is trying to save a person who keeps stepping back into traffic. By October 1985, Marcus was living alone. The apartment lasted 2 more months. The car wash job lasted 6 weeks after that. Both ended through the same mechanism, not a single catastrophic failure, but a slow accumulation of smaller failures, each individually explainable, collectively terminal. The landlord had given 3 warnings about the rent before filing the eviction paperwork. The car wash manager had noted the absences and the increasingly distracted quality of Marcus's work before making the call. Neither of them was cruel. Both of them had seen this before. They processed Marcus's departure with the bureaucratic efficiency of institutions that have learned not to absorb other people's disasters personally. He moved what he owned, 2 garbage bags of clothes, a box of records he'd been collecting since he was 16, a photograph of Keisha in a frame Gloria had given him, to the apartment of a man named Raymond Booker on 63rd Street. Ray was 37, had been using crack for 14 months, and operated his apartment with the pragmatic hospitality of someone who needed bodies around partly for company and partly to distribute the cost of the drugs. He wasn't a dealer. He was an aggregator, a man with a space and a phone number who connected users with supply and took his cut in product. In the language of the street, what Ray ran was a get-high spot. In the language of social services, it was a trap house. In the language of the people inside it, it was just where they were. Marcus told himself it was temporary. The rhythm of a crack addict's day in a trap house bears almost no resemblance to the way television depicted it. Not primarily violent, not primarily chaotic, but mostly characterized by a grinding, repetitive tedium, broken by brief windows of chemical relief, and followed by stretches of physical misery. This was the actual texture of Marcus's life by late 1985, and it was simultaneously more mundane and more horrifying than any dramatization. A typical day began not with waking but with returning to consciousness, because sleep on crack is not sleep in any restorative sense. It's the body's emergency shutdown after extended stimulant use, a collapse rather than a rest, lasting 4 or 5 hours before the brain's depleted chemistry drag the person back to a wakefulness defined entirely by absence. The first thought every morning without exception was the pipe, not food, not the bathroom, the pipe. This wasn't a preference. It was a neurological command issued by a brain that had reorganized its priority hierarchy around a single variable. The hunt for money occupied most of the daylight hours. Marcus had, over the previous months, developed a repertoire of approaches that he cycled through with the methodical creativity of someone solving the same problem repeatedly, with diminishing resources. He collected returnable bottles and cans from garbage cans and alleys, which produced between $2 and $5 on a good morning. He offered to help people carry groceries, shovel snow, move furniture, informal labour that paid in cash, and required no credential beyond showing up. He borrowed from people who still had something to lend, which was a shrinking pool, and then there were the things he'd told himself he would never do. The first time Marcus stole from his mother, it was $20 from her purse while she was in the kitchen making coffee. He had come by ostensibly to visit, to see if there was any food he could eat, to perform the maintenance task of reassuring Gloria that he was fine and managing and on the verge of getting back on his feet. Gloria had believed him, or had chosen to believe him, or had been so desperate to believe him that the distinction no longer mattered. She'd gone to make coffee. He'd taken the 20. He used it within the hour. The shame arrived not during the theft but afterward, in the specific nauseating clarity that follows a crack crash. He could see exactly what he'd done, could see his mother's face, the way she'd smiled when she saw him at the door, the coffee she had made for a son she trusted. The shame was not abstract. It had physical weight, physical location. It sat behind his sternum like a stone and pressed outward against his ribs. He told himself he would pay it back. He told himself this was the last time. He believed both things with the conviction of a man making promises to a version of himself that no longer existed. He stole from Gloria 4 more times before the end of the year. Crack cocaine's physical destruction of the body follows a timeline that the drug carefully conceals in its early stages. The first months of heavy use show relatively little visible damage, some weight loss, some pallor, easily attributable to stress or illness or poor diet. By the end of the first year, the damage becomes legible on the body itself. Marcus, who had been a broad-shouldered, physically capable man of 170 pounds in September 1984, weighed 142 by December 1985. His face had developed the particular hollowness of someone whose body has been consuming its own muscle mass for nutrients, because crack suppresses appetite so completely that regular users simply forget to eat for days at a stretch. His teeth had begun deteriorating, a process caused by the combination of crack's chemicals, the dry mouth it induces, and the severe nutritional deficiency of a diet consisting primarily of whatever was cheapest and closest to the trap house. His skin, once clear, had developed sores on his forearms from the compulsive picking that crack paranoia induces. Users convinced there is something beneath the skin, insects or shards of the pipe or some crawling wrongness, picking at themselves during the crash without always being aware they're doing it. He looked, by any objective measure, like a man who was dying slowly. The people at Ray's apartment looked at him the way people look at themselves in a mirror they've stopped noticing, without recognition, without alarm, because everyone in the room was at some stage of the same process. The paranoia had become a permanent atmospheric condition rather than an occasional episode. The devils that had visited him once in that kitchen in January now lived with him, varying in intensity but never fully departing. He heard things, footsteps that stopped outside the apartment door, voices in the hallway that he was certain were discussing him specifically, the sense of being watched from outside windows that were 3 stories above the street. He checked the door lock compulsively, sometimes 20 times in a single hour. He trusted no one in the apartment completely, including Ray, including the 2 other regulars whose names he knew and whose habits he'd catalogued with the precise, anxious attention of someone who believes their safety depends on monitoring everyone around them. The violence was always near, never predictable. A man named Curtis, who passed through Ray's apartment regularly, was beaten badly in November by dealers he'd shorted on payment, beaten on the front steps of the building in daylight by 2 men who did it with the professional efficiency of people making a point rather than expressing anger. Marcus watched from the window and did nothing, because there was nothing to do and because the message was legible to everyone in the building. Payment was not optional. Proximity to debt was dangerous, and the rules that governed this world were enforced not by courts, but by the people who had the most to lose from the rules being ignored. 3 weeks later, Marcus owed $60 to a dealer named Priest. The debt had accumulated gradually. Small amounts fronted on the understanding that Marcus would pay when he had it, an arrangement Priest extended to a handful of regular customers who had demonstrated reliable return behaviour. The reliability was pharmacological, not personal. Crack users always came back. That was the point. But $60 in the economy of the trap house was not a minor figure, and Marcus had made the mistake of letting it sit for 2 weeks while prioritising other payments. Priest sent 2 associates to Ray's apartment on a Wednesday afternoon. What they did to Marcus took about 4 minutes and left him with 2 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and a deep laceration above his left eye that needed stitches and didn't receive them. He lay on Ray's kitchen floor for an hour after they left, breathing carefully around the pain in his side, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that he'd been staring at for 3 months and never really looked at before. Ray handed him a wet cloth for his face and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because everyone in the house understood this as a cost of the life rather than an aberration. Marcus did not go to the hospital. He lay on the floor, then on the couch, then made it to the mattress in the back room. He had the pipe with him, had been holding it when the men arrived, had somehow kept hold of it through everything. He used it when he could lift his arm without the broken rib sending a spike of pain through his entire torso. The high came. 15 minutes of relief from the pain, from the cold, from the specific knowledge of what he had become. When it ended, nothing had changed, except that somewhere in the building stairwell a telephone was ringing, and it rang for a long time before it stopped. And in the silence that followed, Marcus realised that the person it had been ringing for, the person with a mother who would call, and a daughter who was walking now, and a life that had once pointed somewhere, was still, barely, him. He reached for the pipe again. While Marcus lay on that mattress with broken ribs and a fractured cheekbone, the United States government was busy declaring war. Not on the conditions that had produced him, not on the unemployment, the defunded schools, the closed steel mills, the systematic disinvestment that had turned Englewood from a working neighbourhood into a pressure cooker. The government was declaring war on the people inside the pressure cooker, and it was doing so with the specific legislative precision of a body that had decided punishment was the same thing as solution, The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was passed by Congress with the kind of bipartisan enthusiasm that only appears when politicians believe they are safely on the right side of public opinion. It was signed by Ronald Reagan in October of that year, flanked by members of both parties, all of them projecting the grim satisfaction of people who have decided to be tough about something. The centerpiece of the law was a sentencing provision that would define the crack epidemic's legal legacy for the next 2 decades, the 100-to-1 disparity. Under this provision, a person caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine received a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. To receive the same sentence for powder cocaine, a person needed to possess 500 grams, 100 times as much. The same drug in 2 different forms, triggering the same punishment at 100 times the quantity. The chemical difference between crack and powder cocaine is, in pharmacological terms, the baking soda and the water. The demographic difference between the typical crack user and the typical powder cocaine user was, in 1986 America, considerably larger. The architects of the disparity would later claim it was based on the belief that crack was more addictive, more destructive, more tied to violence. Some of them believed this. The research supporting it was thin and in several cases fabricated. Early studies of crack's effects were conducted in such compressed timeframes and with such methodological problems that they told researchers primarily what the political moment needed to hear. The crack baby epidemic, which dominated newspaper front pages from 1985 onward, was based largely on a single study of 23 infants that was later substantially contradicted by larger, more rigorous research. By then, it didn't matter. The image had been printed, the legislation had passed, and the machine had been switched on. The machine had multiple components, and they all fed each other. The police component was the most visible. In cities across the country, narcotics units were expanded, funded by federal grants that incentivized drug arrests as a metric of success. The more arrests a unit made, the more funding it received, which created institutional pressure to make arrests regardless of their strategic value. Sweeps through South Side Chicago neighborhoods became regular events, large-scale operations that scooped up dealers, users, and bystanders with roughly equal efficiency. The distinction between these categories was sometimes irrelevant to the outcome. Proximity to a drug transaction, in a neighborhood where drug transactions were occurring on every corner, was sufficient grounds for detention, questioning, and in many cases charges. The prosecution component processed the arrests with assembly line speed. Cook County's court system in the late 1980s was handling drug cases in volumes it had never been designed for, which produced a specific kind of justice. Fast, formulaic, and overwhelmingly tilted toward conviction. Public defenders carried caseloads that made meaningful representation mathematically impossible. A lawyer handling 150 cases simultaneously cannot investigate, negotiate, and advocate for each client with anything resembling the care the Constitution nominally guarantees. Most crack cases were resolved through plea agreements, defendants accepting reduced charges in exchange for guilty pleas, which meant convictions without trials, which meant the system could process them faster, which meant more room for the next sweep's arrests. David Mercer was 28 years old when he joined the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in 1986. He was from Evanston, had gone to Northwestern Law, and arrived in the criminal justice system with the clean-handed idealism of someone who had studied injustice in seminar rooms and was now ready to fight it in courtrooms. He believed, in 1986, that the drug prosecutions he was processing were necessary interventions, that locking up dealers was protecting communities, that mandatory minimums were deterrents, that the law as written reflected a coherent social logic. Within 18 months, certain things had started to trouble him. The first was the arithmetic. He was prosecuting in the crack cases that came through his caseload an overwhelming percentage of black defendants from a handful of Southside zip codes. This alone was not, he told himself, evidence of systemic bias. Crack was concentrated in those neighborhoods after all. But the powder cocaine cases that occasionally crossed his desk looked different. The defendants were more likely to be white, more likely to have private attorneys, and face charges that, under the 100-to-1 disparity, resulted in sentences a fraction of the length his Southside defendants received for equivalent quantities of the same substance. The second thing that troubled him was more personal. He was processing a case in early 1988, a possession charge against a 26-year-old man named Marcus Webb, arrested during a sweep near a known drug location on 63rd Street, and found himself looking at the arrest record with an unfamiliar feeling. Webb had no prior convictions. He was clearly a user rather than a dealer. He had a daughter. He weighed, according to the arrest report, 138 pounds, which on a man his height suggested a physical deterioration that incarceration would do precisely nothing to reverse. The charge carried a mandatory sentence that would put him away for 18 months in a facility that had no meaningful addiction treatment program. Mercer processed the case. He did his job, but he kept a copy of the file in his desk drawer for reasons he didn't fully examine. The CIA-Contra connection was the shadow that fell across all of this, acknowledged in certain circles and strenuously denied in others. The core of the allegation, investigated by journalist Gary Webb in the San Jose Mercury News in 1996, sourced to earlier investigative threads from the mid-1980s, was that Nicaraguan Contra rebels being supported by the CIA had financed their operations partly through cocaine trafficking into the United States, and that elements of the US government had at minimum looked away from this activity. The story was attacked immediately and ferociously by major media outlets, then largely substantiated years later by a CIA Inspector General's report that confirmed agency knowledge of drug trafficking by Contra-connected individuals. The full truth of what the government knew, when it knew it, and what it chose to do about that knowledge has never been definitively established to every investigator's satisfaction. What can be established is simpler and in some ways more damning. The cocaine that flooded American cities in the mid-1980s came from somewhere, moved through infrastructure that someone built and maintained, and arrived in neighborhoods like Inglewood in quantities that overwhelmed every institutional response. Whether the government actively facilitated this or merely failed to stop it is a distinction that mattered enormously in Washington and considerably less on South Racine Avenue. Marcus Webb didn't know about the Contra connection. Most people on his block didn't. They knew the supply was constant and the enforcement was selective and the results were catastrophic, which told them what they needed to know about whose interests were being served. Pastor James Ellington had been running the New Life Community Center on South Halstead since 1981. He was 53 years old, had grown up 4 blocks from the center, had buried 3 members of his congregation to drug-related violence before 1985 and lost count after that. He was not a naive man. He had watched the heroin epidemic of the 1970s move through his community and had understood then that a neighborhood in crisis cannot arrest its way back to stability. Crack arrived and confirmed everything he already believed, except worse. The center offered what it could: a clean space, meals 3 days a week, a small room where Ellington ran an informal support group for people struggling with addiction. Informal was the operative word. The center had no clinical staff, no certified counselors, no medical support for withdrawal management. It had Ellington and a rotating group of volunteers and approximately $40,000 a year in funding from a combination of church donations, small foundation grants, and occasional city allocations that arrived irregularly and were never enough. The funding landscape for community addiction treatment in Chicago in the mid-1980s was not a landscape. It was a wasteland. The Reagan administration had converted the federal drug treatment budget into block grants to states in 1981, simultaneously reducing the total amount available. Illinois distributed these grants through a process that community providers described in documents submitted to state oversight bodies as opaque, inconsistent, and systematically disadvantageous to small organizations serving high-need populations. The large established treatment facilities, mostly located in North Side and suburban areas, mostly serving whiter and more economically stable populations, received the majority of available funding. Ellington submitted grant applications to 7 different funding bodies in 1986. He received responses from 4. He received money from 1. The machine, in other words, was not simply the police and the courts. It was the whole architecture of institutional response, or non-response, that surrounded the epidemic. It was the decision to fund enforcement rather than treatment, the decision to impose mandatory minimums rather than create pathways to recovery, the decision to prosecute crack users while funding the political campaigns of people who owned pharmaceutical companies, whose legal products would kill more Americans than crack ever did. There is a specific cruelty in the design of the 100-to-1 disparity that becomes visible when you follow its effects to their logical conclusion. A crack user arrested for possession received a mandatory sentence that removed them from their community, their family, and any support structure they might have, placed them in an institution with no treatment capacity in a population where drugs were freely available, and then released them, months or years later, into the same neighborhood, the same poverty, the same absence of alternatives, with a felony conviction that now made them legally ineligible for public housing, student loans, and many categories of employment. The recidivism rate for crack offenders released from Illinois prisons in the late 1980s was above 70%. This number was cited regularly by politicians as evidence that tougher sentences were needed. It was, in reality, evidence of something else entirely, that the machine was not designed to solve the problem it was nominally addressing. It was designed to process it. To move bodies through a system, generating costs, generating statistics, generating the appearance of response while the conditions that made the response necessary remained entirely unchanged. David Mercer figured this out gradually, over years, at considerable cost to his earlier certainties. He kept processing cases. He kept his doubts to himself for longer than he was proud of later. Pastor Ellington figured it out immediately and spent every day fighting it with $40,000 a year and an open door. Marcus Webb was somewhere in the middle of the machine's gears, being ground, while both of them, for entirely different reasons, were trying to work out what to do about it. Ray's apartment on 63rd Street had its own ecosystem, its own gravity, its own rules that bore almost no relationship to the rules governing the world outside its walls. From the street it looked like nothing, a third-floor apartment in a 6-flat building whose brick facade had been slowly shedding itself for a decade, leaving bare patches that looked like something healing badly. The buzzer system had stopped working in 1983. The hallway smelled of something old and chemical that no one could identify and no one tried to. But step through the door of apartment 3B, and the first thing that hit you was warmth. The radiator worked here aggressively, filling the space with dry heat that made the air thick. The second thing was sound. A television running constantly on a channel nobody had chosen deliberately, providing background noise that served the same function as music in a waiting room. The third thing, arriving a few seconds after the first two, was the specific sweetness of crack smoke. Not unpleasant in the way people might expect, closer to burnt sugar than anything chemical, lingering in the curtains and the carpet and the seams of every surface in the apartment. The apartment was, in the technical taxonomy of the drug trade, not quite a full trap house. Big Rock's operation, the one that supplied Ray and a dozen similar spots across the neighbourhood, ran out of a building on South Paulina that was a trap house in the complete sense. Products stored there, distributed from there, defended from there. Ray's place was downstream from that, a consumption site, a way station, a location where the drug arrived already sold and was simply used repeatedly by a rotating cast of people whose connection to each other was the pipe and nothing else. Big Rock himself came by Ray's apartment once every week or 10 days to collect what was owed and assess the operation with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man who ran several similar nodes simultaneously and had learned to read the health of each one in a single visit. He was 31 years old, physically large, and moved through the apartment with the particular ease of someone for whom violence is a tool kept in a drawer rather than a constant presence. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He didn't need to raise his voice. The fact of him, his size, his stillness, his reputation, which preceded him into rooms the way cold air precedes an open door, was sufficient to maintain the order he required. Marcus watched Big Rock the way prey animals watch predators, with the peripheral awareness of someone who knows not to make the watching too obvious. He understood intuitively that Big Rock was operating in a different register than everyone else in the apartment. Clearer, colder, more purposeful. Big Rock didn't use. This was the detail that Marcus kept returning to, the one that cut through the fog of his own brain chemistry and demanded attention. The man who ran the operation that was destroying Marcus's life had looked at the product and decided not to touch it. He had looked at what it did to people and chosen to stay on the other side of the transaction. The dealer who doesn't use is one of the crack epidemic's darkest recurring figures, not because abstinence is sinister, but because it implies a level of clear-eyed assessment that makes the dealing harder to categorize as simple ignorance. Big Rock knew exactly what he was selling. He watched it work on people every week. He had simply decided that the money was worth more than whatever he would feel in those 15 minutes. The social structure inside the apartment had a hierarchy as real and as carefully maintained as any formal organization, though it was never written down and never spoken aloud. Ray sat at the top of it by virtue of the space. His name on the lease, such as it was, gave him a territorial authority that translated into deference on questions of who was allowed in and who was asked to leave. Below Ray were the regulars, people like Marcus who had established occupancy through consistent presence over months. Below the regulars were the transient users who came for a night or a few days and then circulated to other spots, other suppliers, other temporary landing places. At the bottom were the people Big Rock's operation occasionally sent to the apartment to use up product that was below saleable quality, a category that in practice meant whoever was newest and most desperate. The rules were few but absolute. No stealing from people inside the apartment. This was enforced not by Ray but by collective agreement, because everyone in the space had something someone else might want to take, and the only security available was mutual restraint. No bringing police attention to the building, meaning no loud confrontations in the hallway, no transactions visible from the street, no behaviour that would give a neighbour sufficient cause to make a call, and no debt to Big Rock left unpaid beyond a 2-week window. Marcus had already learned what happened when that last rule was broken. His ribs had healed enough that he only felt them when he breathed deeply, which he tried not to do. The 48 hours that began on a Wednesday in February 1987 were not unusual by the standards of the apartment, which is the most disturbing thing about them. Marcus had money, $30, accumulated over 3 days of bottle returns and a favour he'd done for a man on the next block involving the moving of furniture that Marcus suspected had not been acquired legitimately and had decided not to think about. $30 bought enough product for a session that began Wednesday evening and extended with the particular timeless quality that crack binges have into Thursday morning. The crash arrived around 4 in the morning. Not sleep, but collapse. The body's circuit breakers tripping, consciousness folding inward. He was aware of the apartment around him in a distant, irrelevant way. Someone's radio, the radiator's mechanical breathing, the sound of the city outside. He came back to full consciousness around noon Thursday to find 2 new people in the apartment. One was a man named Terrell, who Marcus knew vaguely, a runner for Big Rock's operation who occasionally passed through. The other was a woman sitting in the corner chair with her coat still on and her hands folded in her lap with a precision that belonged to a different room entirely. Her name was Sandra Cole. She was 41 years old. She had taught 3rd grade at a school on South May Street for 11 years. The children she had taught, the 8-year-olds who had learned to read in her classroom, who had made her Valentine's Day cards and argued with each other about whose turn it was to water the class plant, were in their late teens now, some of them running product for Big Rock, none of them knowing where their 3rd grade teacher had ended up. Sandra's presence in the apartment produced something remarkable. In a space where almost nothing caused visible discomfort, where violence, squalor, and human deterioration had become the ambient conditions of daily life, Sandra caused discomfort. Not because anyone judged her explicitly, not because her situation was categorically different from anyone else's in the room, but because she was a woman who had sat in front of children every day and taught them things, and now she was sitting in a corner chair in a crack house with her coat on, like she'd only stopped in for a moment and would be leaving soon, and everyone in the room understood on some level that she was not leaving soon, and that understanding produced a silence that lasted several minutes before the noise of ordinary life filled it back in. She'd been introduced to crack 8 months earlier by her ex-husband, during a period she would later describe as the worst stretch of her life, a divorce, a move to a smaller apartment, the specific loneliness of a person whose entire social identity had been built around a professional role she was slowly losing the capacity to perform. She had missed 11 days of school in the fall semester. The principal had called her in twice. The 3rd time he called her in, she hadn't come, and by that point her classroom had a substitute, and the paperwork for her termination was being processed. 11 years of building something. The lesson plans, the parent relationships, the accumulating knowledge of how to reach a particular kind of struggling 8-year-old, dissolved in 8 months into a corner chair and a coat that hadn't been taken off. Marcus looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way people look at things that mirror them in ways they're not ready to accept. Then he looked away. The shooting happened Thursday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, close enough to the building that everyone inside heard it clearly. Not the cinematic single shot of television crime dramas, but 3 shots in quick succession, followed by a silence more complete than the noise before it. This particular silence had a quality that everyone in the apartment recognized instinctively, the way animals recognize weather. It meant someone was down. Marcus went to the window. He could see the corner of 63rd and South Paulina from Ray's apartment if he pressed close to the glass and angled his view. What he saw was a boy lying on the sidewalk, one arm extended, one knee bent, the posture completely wrong. Not the posture of someone who had sat down or fallen, but the posture of a body in which voluntary movement had ceased. 2 people stood over him, and then didn't. Then they were gone, moving fast, and the boy was alone on the concrete with a particular stillness that has no ambiguity. His name was Deshaun Monroe. He was 16 years old. He had been a lookout for a corner operation that had been encroaching on territory Big Rock considered his, and his presence on that corner had been read as an escalation by people who made their calculations in those terms. Whether he had understood the stakes of the geometry he'd placed himself in was a question that would not be answered, because Deshawn was not going to have the opportunity to explain his understanding of anything. Several people came out of the building to look. 2 neighbours called 911. An ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. Marcus helped carry Deshawn to the curb, not because anyone asked him to, but because he found himself outside and the boy's arm was near his hand and some reflex older than the addiction moved through him. He straightened. He looked at what he was holding. He set the boy's arm down carefully, as though gentleness still mattered, and then he stepped back and the ambulance was there, and the paramedics were moving with the practiced efficiency of people who have already calculated the probabilities. He went back inside. He picked up his pipe 7 minutes after returning to the apartment, not because he felt nothing, precisely because he felt everything. Deshawn's arm, the weight of it, the specific temperature of it, Sandra in her corner chair, the 3rd-grade teacher who had watered plants and was now somewhere unreachable behind a pair of eyes that had already started going elsewhere. He felt the full weight of the afternoon and the full weight of the preceding 16 months, and the full, clear, unambiguous knowledge of what he was and what he was doing and where it was going. He felt all of it, and he picked up the pipe because the only mechanism he had for managing that knowledge was the one that had created it. This is the part of addiction that doesn't fit the morality narrative, not the absence of awareness, but the presence of it. Marcus knew. He knew exactly, and the knowing made the pipe more necessary, not less, because the only thing that could temporarily dissolve the weight of understanding what he had become was the chemical that had made him into it. The trap house on 63rd Street had a specific gravity that operated on this principle. Everyone inside it understood what they were doing. The understanding was not the solution. The understanding was the problem that required the solution they were already holding. Terrell left before dark. Sandra was still in the corner chair. Outside on South Paulina, the blood on the sidewalk was drying in the February cold, and the corner was already occupied again, and the operation was running, and the city was doing what it had been doing for 3 years, burning steadily, block by block, body by body, 15 minutes at a time. Denise Webb had not stopped loving Marcus when she left. That was the part nobody asked about, and she rarely volunteered, because the narrative that surrounded crack addiction in the 1980s had very little room for the complexity of loving someone who was destroying themselves. The public story needed the addict to be simply lost, and the people around them to be simply surviving, and the truth, which was messier and more painful than either category, didn't fit anywhere cleanly. She was working double shifts at the laundry on South Halstead, days Tuesday through Saturday, evenings Monday and Wednesday, and raising Keisha in her mother's 2-bedroom apartment in Roseland, 12 miles from the building on 63rd Street where Marcus was living. 12 miles in Chicago's geography is not a large distance. In the emotional landscape of what their life had become, it was another country. Denise sent word through Gloria when there was news about Keisha. First steps, first words, the ear infection that had kept them both awake for 3 nights in January. She did this not because she thought the information would change anything, but because she believed, with a stubbornness that had kept her functional through circumstances that would have broken someone with less of it, that Marcus still had a self somewhere inside the addiction that deserved to know his daughter was walking. Keisha was 2 years old now. She called the man in her grandmother Gloria's photographs Dada, with the cheerful imprecision of a child who hasn't yet learned that some words carry weight. Gloria Webb had aged in a way that people who knew her before 1985 noticed immediately, and she never acknowledged. The woman who had raised 2 children alone on a home health aide salary, who had kept the apartment on South Racine warm and the refrigerator stocked through 2 decades of structural adversity, had developed a particular expression that lived on her face in unguarded moments. Not grief exactly, and not anger, but the specific tension of a person holding something heavy for a very long time without being able to put it down. She attended a support group at New Life Community Centre on Thursday evenings, a gathering of 8 to 12 women, mostly mothers, occasionally a wife or sister, all of them connected to someone in the grip of crack. Pastor Ellington ran it with the practical wisdom of someone who understood that these women needed information as much as comfort, concrete tools as much as emotional validation. He told them what crack did to the brain. He told them what recovery actually looked like, as opposed to what the person in their life was currently promising it would look like. He told them that loving someone through addiction was one of the most demanding things a human being could do, and that doing it without losing themselves required a discipline that nobody had taught them and nobody was going to congratulate them for. Gloria sat in the back row and listened with her hands folded in her lap, and occasionally she looked at the photographs the other women brought, wallet-sized pictures of their children at some earlier, healthier time. And she thought about the photograph she kept on her nightstand of Marcus at 20, broad-shouldered and grinning, holding Tanya's baby at her christening. She thought about the version of her son that photograph contained. Then she put the thought away and listened to Pastor Ellington, because the thought was not useful and the information was. The crack epidemic's female casualties occupied a space in the public conversation that ranged from invisible to monstrous, with very little in between. The invisible version was the Denises and the Glorias, the women absorbing the collateral damage, holding families together with the specific, unacknowledged heroism of people doing impossible work that everyone expected them to do, and no one thought to call heroic. The monstrous version was the crack mother, a media construction of the mid-1980s so powerful and so carefully cultivated that it functioned as both news story and political justification simultaneously. The crack mother narrative went like this. Women who used crack during pregnancy were not merely addicts, they were a new category of human failing, willing to sacrifice their unborn children for a 15-minute high. They were producing a generation of damaged children who would cost society incalculable amounts and contribute nothing. They should be prosecuted. In some states they were, charged with delivering drugs to a minor through the umbilical cord, a legal theory so novel that most courts eventually rejected it, though not before a significant number of women had been arrested, imprisoned, and permanently separated from their children. The research that drove this narrative, the crack baby studies of 1985 and 1986, was, as has been noted, deeply flawed. The original study involved 23 infants. Its lead researcher later acknowledged that the results had been overstated in the translation from academic paper to newspaper headline. Subsequent studies involving thousands of children found that the effects of prenatal crack exposure, while real, were significantly less severe than the original hysteria suggested, and were in many cases indistinguishable from the effects of poverty, malnutrition, and prenatal stress, which the crack-using mothers in these studies also had in abundance. None of this reached the public in time to matter for the women it affected. Yvonne Harris was 19 years old when she arrived in Chicago from Greenville, Mississippi, in the summer of 1986. She had a partial scholarship to a community college on the west side, a bag with 2 changes of clothes and a winter coat her mother had saved for 3 months to buy her, and the specific confidence of someone who has been told all their life that they are smart enough to escape and has decided to believe it. She was smart. That wasn't the variable that failed. She moved into a rooming house on West Madison Street, found a part-time job at a pharmacy counter, started classes in September. The scholarship covered tuition but not books, and the pharmacy job covered books but not food, and the rooming house cost more than she'd expected, and by October she was behind on rent and eating one meal a day and studying in a library that closed at 9 and walking home alone in a neighbourhood that scared her in ways she hadn't anticipated when she was planning this from Greenville. The man who introduced her to crack was a neighbour in the rooming house, 24 years old, who framed it as a solution to the specific problem she had: the exhaustion, the anxiety, the grey weight of circumstances that weren't supposed to be this hard. He wasn't wrong about the short-term effect. The first hit did exactly what he'd said it would do. The second hit was 3 days later. The fifth hit was a week after that. She withdrew from her classes in November. She was evicted from the rooming house in January 1987. The pharmacy fired her in February after the third time she arrived late, with the glassy focus of someone operating on 4 hours of crash sleep and the remains of a binge. By March, she was sleeping in a series of apartments belonging to men who exchanged the space and the product for access to her body, a transaction that was not framed as anything explicit, but was understood by both parties in the way that most exploitative arrangements are understood: clearly, silently, without the dignity of honest naming. She was 20 years old. She'd been in Chicago 8 months. The exchange of sex for crack was one of the epidemic's most extensively documented phenomena and one of its most inadequately addressed. Women, disproportionately young, disproportionately black, disproportionately far from any support structure, traded sexual access for drugs with a frequency that public health researchers found staggering when they began systematically tracking it in 1987. The men on the other side of these transactions were sometimes dealers, sometimes other users with slightly more product or money than the women they exploited. The power differential was absolute. The risk of violence, of sexually transmitted disease, of pregnancy was carried entirely by the women. HIV transmission rates in communities with high crack use spiked dramatically through the late 1980s, driven not by intravenous drug use but by the pattern of sexual exchange the drug induced. This connection between crack and HIV was known to public health officials by 1987 and communicated to policymakers by 1988. The policy response was inadequate in the way that all responses to the epidemic were inadequate. Too slow, too small, too focused on criminalization rather than prevention or treatment. Yvonne was tested for HIV at a free clinic on West Chicago Avenue in the fall of 1987. The result came back negative. She used the relief as permission to continue rather than as warning to stop, which was not irrationality, but the specific logic of someone whose brain had reorganized itself around the drug and filtered every other piece of information through that reorganization. She was still in Chicago. She was not going back to Greenville. Going back meant admitting what Chicago had done to her, which meant admitting what the drug had done to her, which meant admitting something she had not yet found the emotional resources to absorb. The partial scholarship was still technically on hold at the community college. She'd spoken to an administrator who had been kind enough not to close the door completely. That open door, thin and distant as it was something she returned to in her mind when the crash was at its worst. A possibility so small it was almost theoretical, but real enough to keep her from letting go of it entirely. Back in Roseland, Denise had started noticing things about Keisha that she needed to decide how to handle. The little girl asked about her father with the persistence of a child who has identified a gap in her world and cannot understand why no one is filling it. She asked Gloria. She asked Denise. She asked with the directness of someone too young to have learned that some questions are dangerous. The answers she received were careful, warm, and completely unsatisfying. Her father loved her. Her father was having a hard time. Her father was going to see her soon. Keisha absorbed these answers with the doubtful look of a 2-year-old who knows she's being managed. Denise was 23 years old. working 60 hours a week, sleeping in a bedroom she shared with her daughter at her mother's house, sending a portion of her paycheck to Gloria to help cover what Marcus used to provide. She was not angry anymore. Anger had been the first stage, burning hot and clarifying for several months, and then it had cooled into something harder and more durable. She was resolved. She had decided that the life she was building would be built around Keisha and herself, and the people who showed up consistently, and that she would not structure her existence around the hope that Marcus would become someone he currently wasn't. This was not cruelty. It was survival arithmetic. She allowed herself, on certain evenings when Keisha was asleep and the apartment was quiet, to think about the man she had met in 1982, the one who had made her laugh at a bus stop by doing a deadpan impersonation of the driver, who had shown up to their first date 45 minutes early and then pretended he'd just arrived, who had held Keisha the first night home from the hospital with the terrified reverence of someone handling something they understand to be irreplaceable. She allowed herself to remember him exactly as he had been, without softening or distortion. Then she put it away and went to sleep. The women of the crack epidemic carried their grief in exactly this way, precisely privately, without the ceremony of acknowledged loss. Nobody held vigils for the relationships that crack destroyed. Nobody counted the mothers who aged a decade in 2 years, the daughters who raised themselves because both parents had been consumed, the women who exchanged their futures for a drug, and the women who stayed behind and paid the price of watching them do it. The official casualty count of the epidemic measured bodies and convictions. The actual casualty count was incalculable and largely silent, distributed across 10,000 kitchens and bedrooms, and Thursday evening support groups where women sat in folding chairs and held photographs and listened to Pastor Ellington tell them the truth about what they were dealing with. Gloria Webb drove herself home from the Thursday group in March 1987, parked on South Racine, and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. She had learned that evening from another woman in the group whose son moved in the same circles as Marcus, that Marcus had been beaten badly several months ago and had not gone to the hospital and had not called anyone and was still in the apartment on 63rd Street. She sat with this information the way you sit with something you already knew and were hoping not to have confirmed. Then she went inside, checked that Tanya's lights were off down the hall, made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and opened her Bible to a page she'd already read 100 times. The words didn't change. She read them anyway. The sweep happened on a Tuesday morning in April 1987 at 6:45, while most of the building on 63rd Street was still in the grey half-consciousness that passes for sleep in a trap house. Chicago PD's narcotics unit had been building a case on Big Rock's operation for 4 months. Not a sophisticated investigation, nothing that would produce RICO charges or cartel-level prosecutions, but a sufficient accumulation of surveillance notes, informant tips, and controlled buys to justify a multi-location operation targeting the supply network's consumer nodes. Ray's apartment was on the list, not because it was strategically significant to the case, but because it was geographically convenient, on the route between 2 more important targets, easy to include, useful for the body count that justified the operation's budget. 6 officers came through the door at 6:45 with a battering ram and the specific organised chaos of a practised entry. Marcus was on the mattress in the back room. He was awake before they reached him. The sound of the door coming apart had detonated through the apartment's silence with a physical force, but awake in the fractured, disoriented way of someone whose sleep is never clean and whose brain takes longer than it should to assemble the present moment from its components. He was face down on the floor within 30 seconds. His hands were cuffed behind him. He was wearing the clothes he had slept in, which were the clothes he'd been wearing for 4 days. The charges were possession of a controlled substance and loitering in a known drug location. Not dealing, not conspiracy. The pipe in his jacket pocket and his presence in the apartment were sufficient. The processing took the rest of the morning. Fingerprinting, photographs, the assembly line efficiency of a system processing high volumes of identical cases with the minimum viable individual attention. A public defender spoke to Marcus for 8 minutes before his hearing, asked 3 questions and advised him to take the plea. He took the plea. 18 months in Cook County Jail, with the possibility of early release at 12 months for good behaviour and population management. Cook County's overcrowding had reached a level where early release was less a reward than a logistical necessity, applied with the selective randomness of a system managing a crisis it had created. Marcus heard the sentence with the specific blankness of someone who has been expecting bad news long enough that its arrival produces not shock, but a grim, tired confirmation. He was processed into Cook County Jail on a Thursday in April 1987. He weighed 131 pounds at intake. The intake nurse noted the sores on his forearms, the malnutrition indicators, the broken cheekbone that had healed imperfectly and given his face a slight asymmetry it hadn't had before. She flagged him for medical evaluation. The evaluation was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which was the standard wait time, and would ultimately consist of a 15-minute examination that confirmed the obvious and recommended nutritional supplementation that the jail's food service was not equipped to provide. Crack cocaine withdrawal is not, in the clinical sense, life-threatening in the way that alcohol or heroin withdrawal can be. This fact has been used, repeatedly and cynically, to justify the absence of medical support for crack withdrawal in incarceration settings. What the clinical definition of life-threatening fails to capture is the phenomenology of what actually happens in a cell during crack withdrawal, what it feels like from inside the body it's happening to. Marcus lay on a bunk in a cell he shared with 3 other men and experienced the first 72 hours of withdrawal with a physical and psychological intensity that he would later describe, in the single extended conversation he ever had about it, as worse than anything that had been done to him from outside. The physical symptoms were the easier part to inventory: profuse sweating, muscle cramps severe enough to fold him around himself, headaches that lived behind his eyes and pulsed with his heartbeat, a fatigue so deep that lifting his arm required a conscious decision and a specific expenditure of will. He shook. He vomited twice the first night into a toilet 3 feet from his sleeping bunk. The psychological symptoms were the dimension that the clinical literature discusses in terms too bloodless to convey anything real. The cravings, and the word craving is so inadequate for what this actually was that using it feels like describing a hurricane as a stiff breeze, arrived not as desire but as physical emergency. His brain, stripped of the dopamine flood it had organized itself around for 2.5 years, was generating distress signals at a volume and intensity that had no natural analogue. The depression was not sadness. It was a neurochemical state in which nothing, not thought, not memory, not the abstract knowledge that this would eventually end, had any emotional weight or positive valence. Everything was grey and wrong, and the only thing his entire nervous system could articulate was the need for the pipe. He didn't sleep properly for 11 days. By the 3rd week, the acute withdrawal had subsided enough for Marcus to exist in the world without every moment being an active emergency. What replaced it was not comfort, not even close, but a flat, grey functional state that addiction researchers call post-acute withdrawal syndrome, a condition that can persist for months and is characterized by anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from normal stimuli, low-grade anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and sleep disruption. It is the neurological hangover of a brain slowly trying to rebuild the reward infrastructure the drug had dismantled. In this state, Marcus had his first clear extended thoughts in years. Clarity, when it arrived, was not a gift. It was a reckoning. He lay on his bunk in the small hours and replayed things with a precision that the constant chemical noise of active addiction had mercifully blurred. The look on Denise's face the night she found the pipe. Gloria's expression the last time he'd visited, and she'd watched him with the careful attention of someone trying to find, in this reduced version, the son she recognized. Keisha's face, which he had seen 4 times in the previous 18 months. 4 times. His daughter was 2 years old, and he had been present for her life the way a weather event is present. Periodically, destructively, without intention. He requested to write a letter to Gloria in his 4th week. He sat at the small table in the common area for 40 minutes with the paper in front of him and the pen in his hand and wrote nothing, because everything true was too heavy to lift into language, and everything manageable enough to write seemed insufficient to the weight of what he needed to say. He put the pen down and went back to his bunk. The crack inside Cook County Jail arrived through mechanisms so varied and so thoroughly documented by subsequent investigations that it reads less like smuggling and more like supply chain management. Correctional officers, not all of them, not most of them, but enough to maintain consistent supply, moved product through the facility in exchange for cash payments coordinated outside. Visitors passed small quantities in handshakes and embraces at levels that intake searches, conducted with minimal staffing and institutional pressure to process people quickly, missed routinely. The jail's physical infrastructure, designed in an era before the crack epidemic, had not been built with the assumption that a smokable drug requiring only a small pipe and a few seconds could be used in a toilet stall or under a blanket with minimal detection risk. Marcus was offered crack for the first time inside the facility in his 3rd week, before his acute withdrawal had fully resolved. He said no. The refusal cost him something physically. His hands shook for an hour afterward from a craving response so immediate and powerful it felt like a near miss with traffic. He said no again in the 4th week, and in the 5th. In the 7th week, he said yes. The relapse inside the facility was, in the clinical literature on incarceration and addiction, entirely predictable. The jail provided no addiction treatment, no counselling, no pharmacological support, no programming aimed at the specific neurological condition that had put most of its drug offence population there. It provided a cell, meals, and proximity to the same drug that had produced the arrest, available at inflated prices to anyone with access to money or something worth trading. The recidivism was not a mystery. It was arithmetic. Marcus used intermittently for the remainder of his sentence, not the desperate, all-consuming consumption of the trap house, but the measured, careful use of someone rationing a scarce and expensive resource. The distinction mattered practically, but not neurologically. His brain's reward system, which had been cautiously beginning to rebuild during those first 7 weeks of abstinence, recalibrated back around the drug with a speed that reflected how deeply it had been restructured during 2.5 years of heavy use. The 7 weeks of withdrawal had accomplished physiological detoxification. They had not accomplished the neurological rewiring that genuine recovery required, and they could not have. That process takes months or years of sustained abstinence combined with specific behavioral and psychological intervention, none of which were available in Cook County Jail. He was released in January 1988, 9 months into his 18-month sentence, as part of the overcrowding management protocol that released non-violent offenders at the 50% mark when population levels exceeded a court-mandated threshold. The release was processed on a Wednesday morning. He was handed the clothes he'd been wearing when arrested. The same clothes, laundered once and stored, now fitting differently on a body that had gained 12 pounds in custody, along with $4 in cash and a bus pass valid for 7 days. He stood on the steps of Cook County Jail at 9 in the morning in January, Chicago winter pressing against every surface, his breath visible in the cold air, the bus pass in his hand. $4, 7 days of bus fare. No address. The social services referral he'd been given at release, a single sheet of paper listing 3 addresses for transitional housing and 1 phone number for a city addiction services line, had a 2-week waiting period for the housing and a recorded message on the phone line that directed callers to a voicemail that was, when he called from a payphone on the jail's corner, full. He stood at the payphone for a moment after the recording ended. He understood the situation completely. Whatever clarity incarceration had granted him, and it had granted some, enough to feel the full weight of the preceding 3 years, enough to experience something in the vicinity of genuine remorse, was operating in a context that provided none of the structural support that clarity required to translate into change. He had no money, no housing, no phone, no job, and a felony conviction that had just been added to his permanent record. The temperature was 11 degrees. The bus route he knew best ran south on State Street and turned east on 63rd. He knew where it went. He had told himself, in those long, clear nights in the jail bunk, that he would not go back there. He had believed himself. The belief had been real. It was still real, in the way that intentions are real. Genuinely held, genuinely meant, and genuinely insufficient against the combined pressure of a restructured brain, a winter morning, and $4 in a city that had no particular plan for him. The number 63 bus came south on State Street and slowed at the stop. Marcus watched it slow. He watched the doors open. He thought about his daughter, who was walking now, who called his photograph Dada, who would be 3 years old in 2 months and had seen her father 4 times in her life. He got on the bus. He rode it to 63rd Street. He did not do this because he had forgotten his daughter or stopped loving his mother or abandoned every value he had ever held. He did it because his brain had been chemically rebuilt around a single imperative, and because the system that had just held him for 9 months had returned him to the street with $4 and a bus pass and nothing else, and because the only place in the city where he knew he could be warm and not alone, and close to the one thing his nervous system was screaming for, was 14 blocks east on 63rd Street. He stepped off the bus. The cold hit his face. He turned east and walked, his hands in his pockets, his breath preceding him in small white clouds that dissolved immediately into the January air. Marcus lasted 4 more months on 63rd Street before the second arrest. This time it was different. Not a sweep, not a net cast wide across a building. This time a narcotics officer named Dwayne Purcell, who had been working the same 6-block radius of Southside Chicago for 3 years and had developed the particular granular knowledge of a neighborhood that only comes from sustained presence, recognized Marcus specifically. Purcell had processed him through the first arrest. He remembered the intake weight, the sores, the improperly healed cheekbone. He had seen enough returns to know the arithmetic of what happened to people released from Cook County with $4 and no plan. When he spotted Marcus near the building on 63rd in May 1988, he didn't radio for backup immediately. He approached alone, which was either compassionate or reckless depending on your interpretation, and he made Marcus an offer that was not quite an offer and not quite a threat, but occupied the space between them with the specific gravity of a decision point. The offer was this: a court diversion program, a pilot initiative, underfunded and operating on a provisional basis that routed certain low-level drug offenders into mandatory treatment rather than incarceration. It required a guilty plea to the possession charge, which added to Marcus's record but avoided additional jail time. It required completion of a 90-day residential treatment program. It required regular check-ins with a supervising officer for 12 months post-completion, and it required, as its operational home, the New Life Community Centre on South Halstead, where Pastor James Ellington had been waiting for exactly this kind of referral for 7 years. Marcus said yes before Purcell finished explaining the terms, not because he was ready. Because jail had been worse. The distinction between saying yes to recovery and being ready for recovery is one that the addiction treatment community has spent decades trying to communicate to the legal system with limited success. Readiness, the genuine, neurologically grounded reorientation of a person's relationship to their own brain and behaviour, is not a prerequisite for treatment. It is frequently a product of it. People enter treatment for the wrong reasons all the time, to avoid prison, to placate a family member, to access housing that requires enrolment. The research on this is consistent and somewhat counterintuitive. Entry motivation has almost no predictive relationship to treatment outcome. What predicts outcome is the quality and duration of the treatment itself, and the support structure available after it ends. Marcus arrived at New Life Community Centre on a Thursday morning in late May 1988, with a garbage bag containing his remaining possessions, fewer than when he'd moved to Ray's apartment 3 years earlier, and the specific wariness of a person who's been processed through enough institutions to expect disappointment from each new one. He weighed 128 pounds. He was 28 years old and looked, by the assessment of the intake volunteer who logged him in, closer to 40. Pastor Ellington met with him for 2 hours that first day. Not to assess him, Ellington had learned over years that assessment in the first days was less useful than presence, that what people needed in the immediate aftermath of a decision to try was someone who would sit with them without flinching, and without the particular brand of professional optimism that functions as its own form of distance. Ellington had seen too many people to perform optimism. He simply sat across from Marcus and told him, with the directness of someone who respected his intelligence enough not to soften it, what the next 90 days were going to feel like. He told him it was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done. He told him the cravings would be physical, consuming, and would arrive at the moments of greatest emotional vulnerability rather than random times, which meant he needed to learn to anticipate them. He told him that recovery was not a state you arrived at, but a practice you maintained, and that maintaining it in the neighbourhood where the addiction had developed, walking the same streets, past the same corners, with the same brain that had been rewired around those locations, was going to require more than willpower, because willpower is a finite resource, and addiction is not. Marcus listened to all of this without the defensive minimization he'd deployed for years. Something had changed in him, not completely, not irreversibly, but enough to make the listening possible in a way it hadn't been before. The 90-day program at New Life was not luxury rehabilitation. It was not the kind of facility that wealthy Americans accessed for addiction treatment, the quiet campuses with nutritionists and equine therapy and private rooms. It was 3 donated rooms above the community centre, 4 mattresses per room, a schedule that ran from 6 in the morning to 9 at night, group sessions run by Ellington and 2 volunteers who had completed their own recovery years earlier, individual check-ins twice a week, and meals prepared in the centre's kitchen by a rotating group of neighbourhood women who treated the act of feeding these particular people as something between charity and ministry. What it lacked in clinical sophistication, it partially compensated for in something harder to replicate with funding: the credibility of shared experience. The 2 volunteers who ran the group sessions had been exactly where the people in those chairs were. They hadn't read about crack addiction in a textbook. They had lived the trap houses, the devils, the stolen money, the broken relationships, the jail cells, the bus rides back to the wrong side of the city. When they spoke, The people in the chairs couldn't dismiss them with the particular contempt that addicts reserve for people who don't understand from the inside. That contempt, protective, necessary, and enormously useful to the addiction, had nowhere to land. One of those volunteers was a man named Trey Simmons. He was 26 years old, had started dealing crack at 15, used it himself by 16, and had spent 2 years in Stateville Correctional Center for aggravated battery related to a territorial dispute that had left one person permanently disabled. He had come through a different program in prison, run by a counselor who had done something nobody else in Trey's life had done, looked at him without the lens of what he'd done and asked, with genuine curiosity, who he was before it. That question had lodged in Trey like a splinter and worked its way inward for 2 years until it became, improbably, a reason to try. He was now 3 years clean and working with Pastor Ellington 4 days a week, a fact that he understood, with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had spent years calculating odds, was statistically improbable and personally precious. Marcus's first 30 days at New Life followed the acute recovery arc that Ellington had described. Brutal, grinding, and punctuated by cravings that arrived with the specificity of memories rather than the generality of hunger. Not just wanting the drug in the abstract, wanting it at the precise moment of a particular emotional state, wanting it when the shame of a specific memory became unbearable, wanting it in the evenings when the light changed and the neighborhood outside the window produced the same sensory cues his brain had spent years associating with the ritual of using. The cravings were worst in connection with thoughts of Keisha. This was not paradoxical, though it felt that way. The neuroscience of it is actually straightforward. The emotional states most strongly associated with crack use were not happiness, but the opposite. The moments of shame, of loss, of the gap between who he was and who he had intended to be. Thinking about his daughter produced those states with particular intensity, and those states triggered the craving response with conditioned reliability. Recovery required learning to sit inside those emotional states without the exit the pipe had always provided, to feel the shame fully without anesthetic and survive it. This is not a natural human capacity. It has to be built deliberately through a process that is genuinely painful and has no guarantee of success. He was in his 7th week when Gloria came to see him. She came on a Sunday afternoon with a container of food she'd cooked that morning, a specific deliberate act of language in a register that required no translation. She sat across from her son in the center's small meeting room and looked at him with an attention so complete and so unguarded that Marcus had to look away initially. He had been avoiding her eyes in his imagination for 3 years, and doing it in person was harder. What she saw was a man she recognized, partially and newly. The physical damage was still legible, the weight, the skin, the asymmetry of the healed cheekbone. But the specific absence that had characterized his face during the addiction, that nowhere else quality that was the external sign of a brain running on hijacked chemistry, was less complete than it had been. He was present in a way he hadn't been. Damaged and present. She didn't say everything she could have said. She had, in those Thursday evenings at Ellington's support group, learned the specific discipline of what to say and what to hold. She told him Keisha was doing well. She told him Denise had asked about him once obliquely through a mutual friend. She ate with him and asked about the program and listened to his answers with the full attention she'd always given him, the attention that had never wavered even when everything else had, the attention that was, in its own way, the most powerful argument for recovery that anyone had put in front of him. He cried once, briefly, in the middle of saying something about Keisha's age that he had lost track of. He hadn't cried in years. The crack had dismantled that capacity along with several others, and its slow reconstruction felt both necessary and almost unbearably exposing. Gloria put her hand on the table between them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The other person whose recovery intersected with Marcus's at New Life was Sandra Cole, the former third-grade teacher from Ray's apartment, the woman in the corner chair with her coat still on. Sandra had entered a women's residential program on the North Side in late 1987, referred by a hospital social worker after an incident that had landed her in the emergency room with hypothermia. She'd been outside for 18 hours in November, a combination of a lost argument over drug money and a series of decisions, each of which had seemed survivable in isolation. The Northside program was better funded than New Life, had clinical staff, had a psychiatrist who visited twice a week. It also had something New Life had in different form, people who saw her as more than the worst version of herself. She had been clean for 7 months when she began volunteering at New Life, making the bus trip from the North Side twice a week with a practicality and consistency that Ellington recognised as the behavioural signature of someone who understood that staying well required doing something with the recovery beyond simply maintaining it. She taught a literacy class on Wednesday afternoons, basic reading and writing for people in the programme whose formal education had been interrupted, which was most of them. She stood in front of those small groups and taught with a specific, unshowy competence of someone who had been genuinely good at something before the drug and was relearning that it was still true. She and Marcus rarely spoke directly. But he attended the literacy class twice and watched her teach and understood something from watching that he couldn't have articulated then, that what the drug had taken could be, not recovered exactly, but rebuilt in a form that acknowledged the damage without being defined by it. He relapsed in his 11th week, 8 days before the programme's nominal completion, not at the trap house, not anywhere near 63rd Street. He relapsed in a bathroom at a family gathering at his aunt's house in Chatham, a neighbourhood several miles from Englewood, a house where nobody was dealing and the gathering was a birthday party for a cousin turning 30. Someone at the party had crack. Marcus found this out through the specific, unwanted radar that active and former users develop, a heightened sensitivity to behavioural signals, the way a person who is afraid of dogs can identify one in a crowd before anyone else. He spent 2 hours at that party managing the knowledge that the drug was present and accessible before the management failed. He used once, came back to New Life the same night. That night, while the single use was still, he told Ellington immediately, not the next day, not after constructing a cover story. That night, while the single use was still in his system and the shame of it was at maximum volume, he sat in Ellington's office and told him exactly what had happened. Ellington's response was neither punishment nor excessive reassurance. He treated it as data, a specific vulnerability, a specific context, a specific failure point that now needed to be understood and planned around rather than simply regretted. He extended the program by 3 weeks to accommodate the relapse. He adjusted the aftercare plan to include more frequent check-ins and a specific protocol for family and social events. Trey, who had relapsed twice in his own recovery before achieving his current 3 years of sobriety, told Marcus something that landed differently than all the clinical information combined. He told him that relapse was not the end of the story unless Marcus decided it was, that the decision, moment by moment, was the only thing that actually existed. Not the drug's history, not the brain chemistry, not the years of damage, the next moment, and then the one after that. Marcus completed the program on a Tuesday in October 1988. He was 28 years old, weighed 144 pounds, and had been sober for 83 days, counting from the night he'd come back to Ellington's office. He had a referral to a transitional housing program that had an actual available bed, a part-time work arrangement at the community centre, helping with maintenance, and a supervised visit scheduled with Keisha the following Saturday. The visit lasted 2 hours. Keisha was 3.5 years old and regarded him with the serious, evaluating attention of a child who has learned that the world contains unreliable things and is trying to determine, without the benefit of experience, which category this person belongs in. He sat on the floor with her and built a tower out of blocks. It fell. They built it again. It fell again. She laughed at the falling, the way children laugh at falling, as though destruction is inherently funny, as though nothing that falls cannot simply be rebuilt. He laughed too. It was the first time in 4 years that laughter had arrived without chemical assistance. The real thing, small and quiet and entirely his own. By 1990, crack cocaine had touched virtually every major American city, and the damage it left behind was not the kind that heals cleanly. The numbers exist, and they are staggering, and they are also insufficient. Between 1984 and 1990, crack-related arrests in the United States increased by over 500%. The federal prison population doubled in a decade, driven primarily by drug offences, the majority of them crack-related, the majority of those defendants black. In Chicago specifically, the homicide rate had climbed every year since 1985 without exception, reaching levels that public health researchers began classifying not as a crime problem, but as an epidemic in the medical sense, a contagion spreading through a population along predictable social vectors, killing people with statistical consistency. The neighbourhoods that absorbed the highest concentration of crack, Englewood, Woodlawn, Austin, North Lawndale, lost population at rates that transformed their physical landscape. Buildings that had housed families stood empty. Blocks that had been dense with commerce became stretches of vacancy, interrupted occasionally by a church or a liquor store. The infrastructure of ordinary life, the grocery stores, the banks, the small businesses that require a stable customer base to survive, followed the population out. What remained was a built environment that communicated, with the blunt eloquence of physical fact, that the people living there were not considered worth investing in. Marcus Webb in 1991 was 3 years sober, working at a grocery store on South Halstead and living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Chatham that he shared with a man from the New Life program named Gerald, who was 18 months clean and working nights at a warehouse on the Calumet River. The same warehouse where Marcus had worked in another life, a fact neither of them examined too closely. The apartment was spare but functional. He had a small television, a modest record collection rebuilt from scratch. The original records had disappeared from Ray's apartment sometime in 1986, absorbed into the trap house's entropy, and a shelf above the kitchen table where he kept a photograph of Keisha and a short stack of books that Trey had recommended over the past 3 years. He cooked his own food. He paid his bills on time. He attended a recovery support meeting every Tuesday evening at New Life, where he now occasionally shared his own story with people sitting in the same chairs he had sat in. Not as inspiration, because he was skeptical of inspiration as a mechanism, but as information. This is what it looks like. This is what it costs. This is what the next moment requires. He saw Keisha every other Saturday. The visits had expanded from the initial supervised 2 hours to full days by the middle of 1990, as Denise's watchful assessment of his consistency had gradually converted to something closer to cautious trust. Keisha was 5 now, in kindergarten, obsessed with drawing and deeply skeptical of vegetables in the way of most 5-year-olds. She called him Daddy with the ease of a child who had decided in her own time and on her own terms that the category applied. He had not repaired things with Denise. That was its own story, with its own timeline that wasn't his to control. She was seeing someone, a man named Bernard who worked for the city and treated Keisha with a steady, uncomplicated warmth that Marcus, in his cleaner moments, was grateful for. The gratitude was real. It coexisted with other things that were also real, that he brought to Tuesday evenings at New Life and set down in the room with everyone else's complicated inventory. Trey Simmons was running the youth outreach program at New Life by 1991, working with boys between 12 and 16 from the surrounding neighborhoods, the age range from which Big Rock's operation and a dozen similar operations recruited their lookouts and runners. He had 5 years of sobriety and a specific, undeceivable understanding of what he was trying to interrupt. He knew the economics. He had lived them. He knew that telling a 14-year-old that dealing was wrong was a conversation that required acknowledging what the alternative looked like. The closed factories, the underfunded schools, the jobs that paid $8 an hour if you could get them and required a clean record to access, which an increasing percentage of Southside young men did not have. He worked with 30 boys in any given season, lost some to the streets, kept others, watched a few go on to do things that surprised him with their ordinariness. Jobs, community college, apartments, leaves that were not dramatic but were intact. He did not measure success by transformation stories. He measured it by the ones who were still alive and still choosing the next moment. Sandra Cole had returned to teaching by 1990, not at her original school, which had moved on without her in the way institutions move on, but at an alternative education program on the West Side serving adults who had interrupted their own educations for various reasons. She taught reading and writing to people between 18 and 50 with the specific, patient intensity of someone who understood from the inside what it meant to have a functional life interrupted and to have to rebuild it from partial materials. She had 4 years of sobriety. She still made the bus trip to New Life twice a month, less as a volunteer now, and more as a reminder to herself of what the distance between that corner chair and this classroom had actually cost, and therefore what it was actually worth. The city they lived in was not recovering. This is the part that the recovery narratives, the individual stories of people who found their way through, can inadvertently obscure if you're not careful about the framing. Marcus was sober, Trey was clean, Sandra was teaching. These were real and significant facts that had required enormous human effort and deserved acknowledgement. They were also 3 people out of tens of thousands who'd been ground through the same machine, and the machine was still running. In 1991, the crack epidemic was not over. It was shifting, changing form, changing demographics in certain cities, beginning the slow statistical decline that would become visible in retrospect, but was not visible from inside it. The neighborhoods it had devastated were not rebounding. The families it had fractured were not reassembling. The children it had produced, raised in households organized around the drug, in buildings in neighborhoods that looked like the aftermath of something, were in elementary school now carrying damage that researchers were only beginning to understand how to measure. The incarceration machine was still running at full capacity, still processing black men from Southside zip codes through the 100-to-1 disparity with the mechanical consistency of a system that had found its rhythm and saw no reason to change it. David Mercer had left the state's attorney's office in 1989, unable to continue a work he could no longer perform with the integrity the job nominally required. He was in private practice now, taking some criminal defense cases pro bono, trying to undo with one hand what he had spent 3 years doing with the other. He was not naive about the math of that project. He did it anyway. The question of what the crack epidemic revealed about America, as opposed to what it simply caused, is the question that the country has most consistently avoided. What it revealed was not new information. It revealed the depth and durability of the fault lines that had always been there, the way poverty concentrates in specific geographies that then receive specific policy responses that compound the poverty rather than address it. The way race operates is a variable in criminal justice with a consistency that cannot be explained by behavior alone. The way institutions respond to crisis in communities of color with enforcement rather than investment, punishment rather than treatment, removal rather than support, and then express confusion when the removal produces the conditions for the next crisis. 20 years after crack arrived in Englewood, opioids arrived in rural white America and suburban America. The response was categorically different. Politicians who had championed mandatory minimums for crack offenders began talking about addiction as a public health issue. Treatment funding increased. Diversion programs expanded. The language shifted from criminal to patient, from moral failing to disease, with a speed that reflected not a change in understanding. The neuroscience of addiction had not fundamentally changed, but a change in whose children were dying. This is not a subtle point. It is the bluntest point the epidemic makes, and it is the one most resistant to being heard by the people who most need to hear it. Marcus was stocking shelves on a Tuesday evening in October 1991 when a woman came down the aisle with a little girl who was exactly Keisha's age, 5, maybe 6, with barrettes in her hair, and the self-important walk of a child who's been given the responsibility of carrying something important in her small hands. The woman was tired in the specific way of someone working too many hours and sleeping too few, but she was there, present, moving through the ordinary miracle of a weekday evening errand with her daughter. He watched them for a moment, not with longing exactly, with something more like recognition, the awareness of what ordinary life actually contained, the weight and the ordinariness of it, the fact that it was available and real, and made of nothing more extraordinary than a woman and her daughter in a grocery store on a Tuesday. He went back to stocking shelves. The building on 63rd Street where Ray had lived was demolished in 1993, condemned by the city as structurally unsafe, a determination that had been accurate for at least 6 years before anyone acted on it. The block where it had stood was a vacant lot by 1994, one of hundreds of such lots scattered across the south side like gaps in a sentence. The neighbourhood had lost 30% of its population since 1980. The elementary school 3 blocks away had class sizes of 34 and textbooks that were older than the children using them. The corner where Deshaun Monroe had died in February 1987 had a different set of young men standing on it, dealing a different product in a different configuration, but operating on the same fundamental economics that crack had written into the neighbourhood's infrastructure and that no policy had since been designed to address. Big Rock was in Stateville Correctional Center, serving a 22-year sentence for drug trafficking and related charges, handed down in 1990 by a federal judge under the sentencing guidelines Marcus's original prosecutor David Mercer had once enforced without question. The irony of this, that the machine consumed the people who fed it as readily as the people who were fed to it, with sufficient time and sufficient exposure, was not lost on Mercer, who had followed the case in the Tribune from his new office on North Michigan Avenue. Priest, the dealer who had sent men to break Marcus's ribs in the winter of 1985, was dead. Shot in 1989 in a dispute over territory that had been contracting as the market shifted and the violence became more competitive and less economically rational. He was 27 years old. He left 2 children whose mother moved them to Milwaukee 6 months after the funeral and never came back. Yvonne Harris was back in Chicago. She had left in 1989, gone back to Greenville for a year, gotten clean through a combination of her mother's house and a church program that offered structure without demanding specific religious belief, and returned to Chicago in 1990 to take a job at the same pharmacy where she'd worked for 3 months in 1986, hired by a new manager who didn't know her history and saw a composed, competent woman who showed up on time. She had re-enrolled at the community college. She was studying nursing. The partial scholarship was gone, but there were other mechanisms: financial aid, work study, the incremental architecture of a plan rebuilt from whatever was still viable after the original had been destroyed. She was 25 years old and had been clean for 2 years and was studying from textbooks in a library that closed at 9, and walking home in a neighbourhood that still scared her in the same ways it had when she first arrived. The fear was familiar now. She had learned to walk through it. Gloria Webb turned 60 in November 1991. Marcus took her to dinner at a restaurant in Hyde Park that was slightly beyond his budget, and sat across from her in a booth while Keisha coloured on a paper placemat with a look of total concentration, and watched his mother laugh at something Keisha said and thought about the photograph on her nightstand, the one of him at 20 before all of it, and understood that the distance between that photograph and this booth was not a story of fall and recovery. It was something more complicated, a story about what a drug could do when it found the right conditions, about what those conditions revealed about the world that had created them, about what it cost to survive that revelation and come out the other side still capable of sitting in a booth with your mother and your daughter, and something that felt, cautiously and without sentimentality, like a future. He didn't feel like a success story. He felt like a man who had survived something that shouldn't have existed in a country that had allowed it to exist, and who was now building something small and real in the space that survival had opened up. The smallness of it was not a disappointment. The smallness was the point. The ordinary life, the stocked shelves, the Tuesday meetings, the Saturday visits, the dinner in Hyde Park, was not a consolation prize for the life he'd been supposed to have. It was the thing itself. The actual substance of being alive, available and present, and his. Crack cocaine had taken 4 years from him. It had taken his apartment, his job, his relationship, his health, his freedom, and a portion of his daughter's early childhood that he would never recover, and had stopped trying to. It had taken the same things from hundreds of thousands of people across American cities, with a thoroughness and efficiency that no war had matched. What it hadn't taken, what it couldn't take, despite everything, was the capacity to begin again. Not to go back, not to undo, but to take the next moment and then the one after that, which was the only direction time actually moved, which was the only thing in the end that any of it had ever required. Keisha finished colouring and held up the placemat to show him. He looked at it. He told her it was good. She nodded with the certainty of someone who already knew that, who had done it for herself, and was simply allowing him the privilege of seeing it. Outside, Chicago pressed on in the November dark, vast, indifferent, scarred, and still producing people who woke up every morning and chose the next moment and the one after that, which is the closest thing to hope that a city or a person can honestly claim.